Hi everybody, and welcome to the podcast in conjunction with Care England. We know how busy you all are at the moment in the care sector, so we hope that this video will give you some key thoughts when it comes to employment law in this COVID-19 world. My name is Mick Feather and I'm the Care Business Manager for Citation, and I work alongside the Care Association partners to support members with health and safety, employment law and many other services to support you as care providers. I've worked at Citation now for over 3 years, and prior to that I was a CQC inspector for 5 years, but don't hold that against me. We've partnered with Care England for many years, and we're delighted to be joined by Professor Martin Green. In my mind, Martin has put the social care into the Department of Health and Social Care. And amongst many other things, whenever I see the Health Secretary wearing a care badge, I'm reminded that Martin was instrumental in making that happen. So Martin, first of all, would you like to introduce yourself, who you are?
Thank you very much. I'm Martin Green. I'm the Chief Executive of Care England, and we're a representative body for care providers, and we have about 4,000 plus services in our membership. Our membership includes people who deliver services for older brain injury units and some mental health units. So I think we cross the entire spectrum. We have charitable as well as business members as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. And Gillian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Gillian McAteer. I'm Head of Employment Law at Citation. I've been a solicitor for 28 years. 17 of those years I've been at Citation as a solicitor on the employment advice team, and then I ran the employment advice service at Citation for about 10 years, and then a couple of years ago I moved into my current role, which is where I'm responsible for overseeing all the employment law output across all the various departments, and obviously that means working very, very closely with care organisations and businesses across all various different sectors.
Great. Well, I think I've got lots of things, Gillian, that I'd like to ask you and that my members come and talk to me about. And I guess one of the most important things I want to start with is the issue about both health and well-being. And this has been a particularly tough time for people who work in the care sector. And it's really important that care providers understand their role in maintaining the health and well-being of their staff and team members. So I guess I'd like to really ask you, what do you think are the 3 most important things that care providers should do in order to maintain good leading teams?
Well, I think first of all, promoting a culture where people feel comfortable about talking about these issues is so important. In fact, we had seen even before the current crisis that mental health and well-being was possibly one of the most pressing issues for businesses, and of course that's just been completely magnified during the current crisis. But getting that people feel able to talk about it, and in fact I think even going further than that and promoting the whole concept of well-being and mental health as something that everyone should be focusing on. I think there is a tendency for people to be very reactive about it. And so you might think that when someone comes to you and says, I've got a problem, then you kick in. I actually think it should be that age, and in fact you should be talking to all of your team about their mental health. Everyone should be focusing on what they can do to promote that, because actually there probably isn't a single person in the country who isn't affected to some extent or another, but particularly in the current crisis. So having initiatives whereby we have, for example, in Citation, we've got posters that we put up promoting mental health throughout the business. We send out regular emails now that most of us are working remotely. We have mental health first aiders, which is something which I think is a good idea for some businesses to think about. Perhaps people, putting people through the mental health first aid training course, where actually they are seen as ambassadors, they're promoted in the business. These are the people, if you don't want to talk to a manager, these are the people you can go to and talk to about it. I also think that training managers, they're very often your first line of defense and actually picking up these issues at an early stage. So knowing what to look out for and giving them the confidence in order to be able to start those conversations is really important, and actually making sure that they approach those conversations in a really empathetic way. I mean, as a manager, for 20 years, I've personally been involved in situations where I've had to support individuals, and I think, and it's sometimes supported individuals in circumstances where I was actually the first person they had spoken to about this. Members of their own families hadn't known about it. So I think approaching it with great empathy and, sharing perhaps some of your personal experiences when you felt, that you've gone through a very difficult period, so that they can see that actually this is not something which is just, and I think a lot of people think there's a stigma about it, that you're admitting that you're not coping with things. So actually anything that says, look, this is perfectly normal, we all feel like this at one stage or another, is often a very important step to progressing. And also, if you have, as a business, employee assistance programs, I think that's very important to know the limitations of actually how far you can help, because sometimes people will need to speak to a professional. Very often businesses will have that support, but will not think about actually promoting it. I know I've probably said far more than 3 things there, but actually there is one point I would want to make, because I think it's a very practical approach, because a lot of people may listen to this and think, well, we have all the willingness in the world to do this, but actually where is a good starting point? And I would recommend something like Mind's wellness action plans, because it is a good starting point in actually identifying practical steps about what people need to be aware of and looking after their own mental health. It gives a starting point for a discussion with the manager, and then it also then helps the manager understand their needs and support them. So I think that, in terms of giving a real practical, solid way to start this conversation is an excellent.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Gillian. And one of the things that I think we should really be focused on is this issue of proactivity. This is something that you shouldn't come to when there's a crisis. It should be something that's absolutely central to how you support staff. And I think it's also important that we'll have members of staff who are self-isolating or shielding at the moment, and we must not forget them and our responsibility to them as part of our team. So make sure that you give a lot of thought to how you reach out to people who might not be coming into work every day because of their own health needs. And I think the points you made were extremely helpful. I guess the next challenge for some employers is that if people need time off because of mental health issues, the practicalities of how they as employers manage that, and particularly how they manage it sensitively, and give not only the support needed for the people, but also recognition that they still have to maintain their services. And I think that's a really tough one. So have you got any advice for care providers in that context?
It is very tough, and actually there is no magic solution. Often you are relying entirely upon your managers in handling those situations well. So, and I think we've got to recognise how difficult it is for managers, because they're working under the conflicting pressures of meeting the needs of the business, but also looking after the welfare of their team. So I think We talk a lot about supporting teams. I think that really begins with supporting managers, and in fact, I would even go further and to say supporting the leaders of the business. That's something, I know it's a little bit of a deviation, but I've got to say that's a real concern for me, that people are trying so hard to be supportive and throw their arms around their team that they forget the fact that actually as leaders of businesses, especially in care, you have really had to undergo incredible pressure, making decisions in the most critical of situations over the last few months without any sort of relief at all. And that is going to take a pressure and carry a toll on individuals. So first of all, I think you've got to promote your own self-care and realise that actually you have needs. I was mentioning this in a webinar the other day, and the host was saying, well, it's just like when you get on an aircraft and you're told, right, you know, you've got to put your own mask on in the event of emergency before you can help others. So I would think, yes, obviously it's not detracting from the need to support others, but please recognise the effect that this is having on you and the need to actually prioritize your needs, or you come to a point where you hit a brick wall and actually you're not able to make effective decision making in your business. But then, as I say, support your managers, because very often when they're under that pressure, it does affect the quality of the decision making. And when they are thinking about the needs of the business, it's very tempting then to behave inconsistently with regard to those employees. And ultimately, if people do need to take time off because of their mental health, that there's an overriding obligation on the employer to look after that individual's needs, and that can't be forgotten because of the needs of the business. So very, very tough, no simple answer to it, but those priorities need to be very clear.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think particularly we should remind ourselves that people who need time off for mental health and well-being reasons are the same as people who might need time off for physical reasons. And we shouldn't differentiate. It's a member of staff, a valued member of a team who needs support at a time of challenge and difficulties. And I think that's, you know, the things that you said, and particularly the things you said about making sure that leaders were protecting themselves as well, are really important, because no team can function unless all the cogs are working effectively.
Absolutely.
And I see the leaders oil of that engine. So if there's no oil in that engine, then the engine will grind to a halt. So I think it was a point well made. I guess one of the other issues,
sorry, Martin, Sorry, I was just going to say, coming back to the point that you made, I think earlier, about including people who were absent from work, if they were shielded, for example, in your communications. I think that's also a very important point to remember when people are taking time off because of their mental health, because sometimes there is a feeling that if people do need time away, then that means you've got to cut off all contact altogether. I think very often managers are concerned that if they do stay in touch, that will seem to be in some way harassing people. But actually, that can engender a sense of isolation, that they've been forgotten about at work. So supportive ongoing activities, I think, is really important.
I guess also one of the things that we found during COVID is that we've seen more people wanting to enter the social care workforce. And I guess that recruitment and retention has always been one of our big challenges in the sector. So how would you suggest that organisations go about this in ways that are good quality and sustain the workforce and reduce the amount of turnover? Because a turnover, of course, is not only incredibly unsettling for the stability of the business, but it's also incredibly expensive. And if we have a good, stable workforce that is nurtured properly, we can use the money that we were using for recruitment and retention for things that are much more about enabling staff to develop their careers, for example.
Yes, and I think there's new pressures now, because obviously there are a lot of people, and we've heard this anecdotally from clients who have said that they've got a lot of people who are entering, and you know, they've recruited them and there's issues in the probation because actually they just didn't have an expectation of what the job was going to be like. So I think that if it's, and in fact, that's not even something which is solely in the sort of, in the area of people who are entirely new to care. I mean, we've had clients before who have had taken on people who were experienced in working in adult residential care and actually then joined domiciliary care and actually were completely ill-equipped for understanding the different requirements of those roles. So I think it's really, really important to be as honest as possible about what the role is going to be, so people's expectations are clear from the start. The sorts of things which we have seen clients use is, you know, putting together little videos even on an iPhone, you know, obviously not, you know, involving any service users, but just this is the typical day in the life of, you know, told from the point of view of a carer, so people get a real flavour of it. And it also personalises it as well, you know, doing shadowing before they advance any further, just so they can really get a good idea of what's involved. And I think generally then in terms of getting the right people and getting people to stay, it's going to be very much focusing in your recruitment process about you know, attracting the sort of people who are going to reflect the values and behaviours of your organisation, and thinking about that and building that into your recruitment process. You know, in the interview questions you use, you know, thinking about what those values are and asking questions which are going to draw out those elements in the candidates. And then, of course, when you find people like that, making sure that you throw your arms around them. I think it's a great idea to have a buddy system in place, because people don't necessarily want to run off and ask their manager questions all the time. So it's great to actually, a great way of making people feel part of the team right from the very beginning, and really engender that team spirit. And it's great for people who are asked to be a buddy, because, you know, they're seen to epitomise, you know, what's great about the business. Obviously fantastic training and a really well thought out induction plan as well. I think those are all really key to make sure that, you know, you start someone off on the right track and you keep them on the right track.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And when you've got your staff and they're nicely on board, I guess the next challenge is, how do we retain them? How do we maintain their interest, their enthusiasm? How do we ensure that they see this as a career where they have opportunities for the future?
Well, I think definitely things like having the right culture. I mean, people talk a lot about having a very difficult business to think, well, but how do you just grow a culture? How do we establish that culture? So I think it is about thinking about the organisational values. Those organisational values should not come from the leaders saying this is what our values are. Very often these are things which your employees instinctively know. It's the things which they love most about their job. It's the things which they love most about working within the business. And you will naturally have those cultural ambassadors within your workforce. So what you want to do really is draw upon them, take your values from speaking with people and actually saying, well, these are your values, this is what we are saying is important, and then embed them through every stage of the process. So it's not, you know, I see businesses who make the mistake of rolling out values and making a big splash and then completely forgetting about it. So this should be absolutely something which is core to your recruitment process, for any one-to-one, any appraisals you do, constantly promoted throughout the business. And I think that really helps make people feel pride about where they're working for, you know, knowing that, and people feeling that they've got a purpose and they're working in a team which reflects their values. I think that's incredibly important. I also think working in for a business which actually invests in them, you know, training and development. We see time and time again in surveys, this comes across as being something which really promotes loyalty with an organisation, because they can see that you are interested in their development. So that's very important. Again, you know, as we were talking about earlier, the emphasis on well-being. You know, and I think now more than ever, the fact that the employers who actually are standing up and saying, look, we see you as individuals, we care about you as individuals, what support do you need? That's going to go a long way in retaining staff. On the converse side, I suppose that's all the pull to keep people within the organisation. You also have to think about the push factors as well. And very often the reason people leave will be because of poor management behaviour. I think at a time where people are working under so much pressure, it is tempting for those to bubble to the surface. You know, you'll find people dealing with others inconsistently, perhaps being a little bit controlling, perhaps, you know, not trusting people as much, not being as open, maybe because they are working under so much pressure, not being as accessible to other members of staff. So I think that it's really worthwhile, again, investing in the managers, you know, to make them mindful. A lot of time managers have very little time spent on training them on good leadership skills. So spent on things to look out for, investing in them, I think then, you know, really pays an organisation back multifold later down the line.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Julian. And one of the things I think is the big problem actually in lots of sectors in the UK is that people think just because you've been a good practitioner, you'll make a good manager or a good leader. And in fact, the difference between management and indeed the difference between management and leadership and being a practitioner are huge. And I don't think we invest enough time in enabling people to be those good leaders and managers. And I think that's something as a sector we need to think more strategically about. The other area which we did touch on earlier was we've seen, because of COVID, a lot of people in other sectors, like for example hospitality, now thinking that they will develop a career in care. And on the one hand, we desperately want those people because they'll be good people with good, particularly interpersonal skills, hopefully. But on the other, we need to present this sector realistically so that they don't get a false impression of what they're coming into. And I guess it's a real challenge for care providers to know how to present in a way that's both attractive but also realistic. Have you got any tips for care providers on that sort of issue?
Well, I do think that, I mean, it's fantastic that the care profession is getting the recognition now, and it's seen as, you know, something that people will be attracted. Absolutely wonderful. But the danger is that people will be caught up with everything they've seen over the last couple of months without actually having any sort of reality to what the job is like. And there could be nothing worse for businesses than getting people in who have got unrealistic expectations, because they're unlikely to stay, or if they are staying, they're going to be on job sites all the time, and no one's going to win out of that situation. So as I said, you know, being as realistic as possible, perhaps having people come in, you know, for a tester session, you know, just to see what happens in a shift, and experience that if they're new to care, I think would be very important. Although, you know, some people think they don't want them to see anything which might put them off. We want to attract people. You're not going to attract them and keep them if they can't cope with the reality of the situation. So that's the sort of thing that I would really focus on, because it's very difficult in a job, just in a job interview, in displaying that reality. So whether it's a video or whether that's getting them in for a couple of hours just to shadow people, I think that's going to be a much better, give them a much better representation of what it's like.
Yeah, and I also think there's another issue which is a big challenge for care providers, and I'd really like your views on this, Gillian, which is particularly at a time when teams are very pressurised and having difficult things to do because of the unusual nature of COVID. But there is also a responsibility for employers to behave in ways that are about protecting their residents, etc. So how would you advise employers to go about the issues around, for example, disciplinary action, which sometimes may be needed, but in the midst of a crisis, people might shy away from dealing with? And it'd be really interesting to get your views on how you manage that tension.
Oh, I completely agree. I think there is a big temptation at the minute to actually think, well, everyone's under pressure. Probably the managers are under pressure and think, well, actually, if I'm going to take action about that, I haven't got time to carry that through. That's going to take meetings, it's going to take an investigation, I'm going to have to take some statements. But the big danger with that is that standards slip. And I think that is, you've got to me, the byword would be that you maintain your standards so people know that you are not letting anything slip at times like this, because I think that really is a road you don't want to go down, because actually then if other members of the team see that people are getting away with things, it's either demotivating for them because they lose a bit of pride in the organisation because they think, oh, well, this is now acceptable, and you know, worst case scenario, they then let their standards slip. And before you know it, things are just really not very acceptable at all. So I think you've got to maintain those standards, because if people can say that they're being maintained and you're not accepting a lesser standard of behaviour, that's very important. Where it can then be factored in is in the mitigation you look at for that, you know, how that individual has been treated. Because as part of the fair disciplinary process, you will not just what the individual did, but any mitigation around that. And so therefore, any particular pressures that that individual was under may then come into bearing in what you think is the appropriate sanction. But I would really say, I know it's difficult, I know everyone's under pressure, but don't let standards slip and don't let behaviour slide.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And it's particularly important when you've had staff who've been with you a long time and then they suddenly do things that are completely out of their normal behaviours. Trying to understand what the root causes were is really important, I think. The other issue that I want to turn my attention to now, and which is a big issue for care providers at all times, but I think particularly at this time, is the issue of safeguarding. And how do we make sure that safeguarding is still central to the work that we do? And how do we support staff to see safeguarding as something that is an important part of the system and the checks and balances, but not to see it as personal attack on their practice, or indeed to see it in a way that if it requires their practice to be changed, we can do that in a collaborative way rather than in a witch hunting sort of a way.
Absolutely, and I think this really brings everything together, doesn't it? From the time that you first bring an employee on and being very clear, the standards that are expected from them, and having a really robust training process, and then making sure that managers are actually enforcing that all the way through. So, you know, it should be unusual in an ideal world for someone to suddenly be displaying behaviour which is not acceptable further down the line, if all those basics elements have been put in place to begin with. One of the reasons why you may have problems is it's the effects of, particularly at the moment where people are under so much pressure, it's the mental health issues which then start to crop up, which then brings about a change in behaviour. And again, you know, prevention is so much better than cure. That's why it really is best to focus on that proactive approach we talked about in terms of you know, encouraging people to talk about issues, you know, getting those issues to the surface before you do have a safeguarding situation. I mean, we have noticed an increase in client concerns with employees in terms of safeguarding issues, and very often it is something that would not have appeared previously. So it is something which has been very much down to the way in which they've been operating. But again, it's all about consistency. It's about making sure that you keep those standards. But it's, again, as so much does rest on the managers, as being your eyes and ears and seeing what's going on, having a culture within your team that actually people will speak standards as an organisation of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable.
Yeah, I agree, and it's about the transparency, but it's also, I've seen very effective use of these forensic analysis of safeguarding incidents as a learning and development tool, where everybody sees the benefit of really looking at what went wrong or what went on and trying to find ways to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Yes.
Well, Gillian, can I say a big thank you to you? This has been a really, I think, very useful seminar, and I know my members will be very interested in the things that you've had to say. And I think it really underlines the point that those people who are connected to citation have access to all these amazing resources that can help them in the best of times, but also how incredibly important they are in the most difficult and tough times that we're going through at the moment. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank all your colleagues for the fantastic support you offer to our sector.
Oh, thank you.
Mick,
I'd
back to you now.
Martin, thank you very much for your time. Keep up the brilliant work. Great questions. And
Thanks.
thanks very much, Gillian, for your great answers too. So thank you all and enjoy.
My pleasure. Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Everyone.